Deep in the mountains of West Virginia, the night fog was as thick as a bowl of cold, unyielding soup. The alien vanguard, known as the Silencers, were renowned across the galaxy for their unrivaled sonar perception network. They could hear a human heartbeat from 3 miles away and execute flawless decapitation strikes in pitch darkness. Right now, Squad Captain Zero was leading 19 subordinates in a ghost-quiet approach toward the entrance of an abandoned coal mine. Suddenly, the dead silence was violently ripped apart by an agonizing, erratic screech, the pressure release valve of Old Man Boyd's heavily modified moonshine still. The shriek ricocheted through the labyrinthine underground mine shafts, amplifying 100-fold in a fraction of a second. Zero dropped to his knees in pure agony. His hyper-developed auditory nerves were practically being torn apart by the chaotic physical sound waves. A heartbeat later, blinding work lights flared to life deep inside the mine, accompanied by deafening, distorted heavy metal blasting from a beat-up phonograph. A handful of miners clad in denim overalls marched out, leveling Remington shotguns packed with rock salt. "Up here in Appalachia," old Boyd said, digging a pinky into his ear, "too much quiet'll get a man killed." Old Boyd's rough thumb swiped across the hammers of his double-barreled Remington. His knuckles were permanently tattooed with coal dust and the stubborn stains of raw moonshine. He didn't give these hairless, glow-in-the-dark bastards a split second to react. He planted his boots, raised the iron sights, and squeezed the trigger. The first blast shook a handful of loose coal dust from the ceiling. Finger-sized chunks of rock salt hit like a sledgehammer, violently punching straight through the transparent visor of the lead Galactic Silence Vanguard soldier. The bastard didn't even have time to grunt. The shockwave of the gunshot turned his fragile auditory nerves to absolute mush on the spot. Purple blood instantly geysered from his eye sockets and ear canals. He fell backward into the thick fog, dead before he hit the dirt. Boyd dropped his wrist to handle the recoil, and the second barrel roared. A second soldier had barely raised his resonance rifle before half his visor was shredded by the salt blast. His hearing organs were blown to pieces. He violently twitched twice, then collapsed into a motionless heap of alien wreckage. The remaining 17 soldiers immediately broke formation. Every single one of them was hunched over, clutching their ears. The warning lights on their subsonic shielding suits blinked a frantic, bloody red in time, with the moonshine stills screaming valve. Not one of them could keep a steady grip on their weapons. Boyd lazily rested the smoking shotgun against his shoulder. He thumbed the breech open, fished 2 fresh rock salt shells from his pocket, and took his sweet time loading them. His cloudy eyes cut sideways, locking onto the alien commander standing at the back of the pack in his specialized combat armor. Zero clamped his hands over his bleeding ear canals. His fingernails dug brutally into the seams of his armor, his knuckles turning a sickly, pale white from the blinding pain. Every single screech from that moonshine pressure valve drove like a red-hot chisel into Zero's exposed auditory nerves. His prized biological sonar array, capable of locking onto the exact frequency of a pin drop 3 kilometers away, was completely compromised. His tactical HUD was nothing but a churning sea of jagged, blood-red static. He couldn't even lock onto the outline of the old Earthling, standing a mere 5 meters away. The collar of his subsonic shielding suit had already been fractured by the initial shotgun blast. Nothing in the Vanguard's arsenal was engineered to defend against this kind of crude, chaotic, macro-scale noise. Every vibrating rock in the cavern felt like it was funneling crushed glass directly into his brain. The edges of his vision were going black. Purple blood dripped from his chin onto the coal-dusted earth, blooming into a bizarre dark stain. His grip on his armor was so tight from the pain that he was nearing the crush limit of the plating. His normally arrogant, crystal-clear compound eyes were flooded with physiological tears. He scanned the surviving 17 soldiers of the Galactic Silence Vanguard. Every single one was bent double, hands clamped over their ears. Purple blood ran freely between their fingers. Their visors were webbed with cracks, and their shielding functions were totally fried. They were all standing in place, shivering uncontrollably. The sheer kinetic force of the noise had shattered their physical ability to even pull the triggers on their resonance rifles. Zero bit down on his numb jawplate. Clinging to his last shred of consciousness, he forced a blood-choked command through his throat. Initiate full tactical retreat. Fall back into the arboreal cover. The soldiers bolted like they'd just been handed a pardon from death row. They stumbled and crashed through the branches, plunging into the fog-choked oak forest. Even the sharp, crisp crack of their boots snapping dead twigs sent ripples of suppressed, agonized groans through the squad. Zero leaned heavily against a rock and slowly backed away. His eyes remained dead, fixed on the old man in the greasy overalls standing at the top of the slope. The old man kept the double-barreled Remington leveled right at Zero's center of mass. A cat-and-mouse smirk was carved into his wrinkled face, while that god-forsaken whistle continued to blast in all directions across the mountainside. Boyd freed up his left hand, reached for the gate valve lever on the side of the still, and yanked it down. The ear-splitting screech cut off abruptly. Then, he reached deep into the oversized pocket of his overalls and pulled out a battered CB radio, the paint so chipped you could barely make out the brand. He cranked the knob. The second the crackling static hissed to life, he tuned it to the local mountain man frequency and hollered so loud the speaker almost blew out. "Grab your dynamite and your chainsaws and get your asses down to Old Mine 3. We got glowing, hairless vermin crawling in the hills." The radio instantly exploded into chaos. A chorus of rough, gravelly voices fought through the static. Somebody asked if they were shooting it out with the tax boys again. Somebody else hollered, asking if they should bring the fresh bundles of black powder they'd just rolled up. Boyd roared back, ordering every last man to rip the mufflers off their pickup trucks. The louder, the better. And any sumbitch dragging his feet tonight ain't getting a drop of the new corn mash. The thick fog rolled up the valley, cloaking Zero's silhouette in half-shadows. Dark purple blood dripped through the fingers of his armored gauntlets. Every whisper of wind through the oak leaves felt like a glowing hot resonance needle plunging into his unprotected auditory nerves. The biosonar array in front of his face was crawling with jagged, blood-red corruption. He couldn't distinguish the exact outline of the old human on the slope at all. He could only vaguely track a dense, rock-hard heat signature pointing a crude gunpowder weapon directly at him. He transmitted a tactical gesture through his fingertips. 5 of the 17 remaining soldiers immediately broke off, hugging the shadows of the brush to flank the target. Their cold, gleaming resonance rifles were raised, safeties silently disengaged. Zero gritted his teeth and took a half-step back, leaning against the cracked bark of an old oak tree. The heavy beating of his own heart vibrated in his chest, making his skull throb. He was the absolute elite of the Galactic Silence Vanguard. He was born to execute elegant, graceful kills in the absolute quiet of a vacuum. When had he ever been pushed into a god-forsaken corner like this? The 5 soldiers reached the rocks on the flank. Their crosshairs settled squarely on old Boyd's silhouette up on the ridge. They gently squeezed the triggers of their resonance rifles. The anticipated silent pulverization of internal organs never happened. The dense, overlapping tree trunks and the heavily fissured granite walls shattered the emitted resonance waves. Every single ricochet wildly distorted the frequency, making it impossible to focus the energy on the target. The scattered resonance waves bounced right back to the soldiers' own feet, violently jarring their already ruptured ear canals and sending fresh streams of pale purple blood pouring out. Zero stared at the chaotic mess on his sonar screen, his fingertips trembling uncontrollably. Just as he raised his hand to recall the 5 out-of-position soldiers, a deep, heavy, and increasingly distinct tremor surged through the rotting humus layer beneath his boots. It was rolling down the pothole-riddled mountain road, pressing straight toward the oak grove. 7 or 8 straight piped V8 diesel engines simultaneously erupted into a bone-rattling roar. Blinding, high-lumen spotlights tore the cold, wet fog to absolute shreds. Massive off-road tires churned up gravel and deep mud as the convoy charged wildly down the ruined mountain road, heading straight for the tree line. The bed of every single pickup was loaded to the brim with tightly bound bundles of black powder, grease-stained logging chainsaws, and crates of still-warm moonshine. All the mountain men were wearing thick, heavy-duty industrial earmuffs stolen from the quarry. Rough, raspy laughter and curses leaked out from under their headsets. The CB radios in their cabs were blasting roars of "kick these hairless freaks back to whatever damn galaxy they came from." A guy leaned halfway out of his truck window, pointed his shotgun at the sky, and racked off a round. The spent shell casing bounced off his door panel with a crisp ping, triggering a wave of raucous laughter. The 5 flanking soldiers, hiding in the oak brush, were already clutching their bleeding ears, barely holding on. The sudden, explosive roar of the diesel engines smashed right through their dead subsonic shielding. Purple blood instantly sprayed from every orifice on their faces. The first soldier rolled out of the brush in pure agony, trying to raise his resonance rifle, but the massive mud tire of the lead pickup rolled squarely over him. The subsonic shielding suit crumpled like wet paper. The muffled crunch of his shattering skeleton was instantly swallowed by the thunder of the V8. The remaining 4, who weren't directly crushed, collapsed into the dirt, twitching and clawing desperately at their own throats. Within seconds, they stopped moving entirely. The entire hillside was shaking violently under the roar of the V8s. Oak leaves and frozen dew rained down in sheets. Loose rocks tumbled down the slope into the ravine. Blinding headlights swept through the dense oak woods. The heavy, diesel-soaked sound waves stacked layer upon layer, slamming mercilessly into the deep brush where Zero was hiding. His bio-sonar array, already corrupted with red static, was instantly blown out into a blinding dead white void. It was completely fried into a useless piece of glass. Zero's wrist-mounted tactical comm screen aggressively blinked 5 times. The life signs of the 5 flanking squads blinked out, one by one, gone forever. He had to brace his hands on his knees just to stand upright. Every breath he took was accompanied by an agonizing, high-pitched tinnitus. He could physically feel his cranial nerves spasming and short-circuiting. The open oak forest couldn't even begin to block out this brutal macro-scale noise. The shock waves slammed into the Appalachian granite and rebounded, steamrolling back and forth over the surviving 12 Galactic Silence Vanguard soldiers. Every single one of them was squatting behind rocks, clutching their heads. Their resonance rifles lay forgotten in the dirt. A fine mist of purple blood seeped from the ventilation slits of their visors. The sheer kinetic force of the noise had crushed their will to even lift a gun. Zero's blurred biological vision swept the hillside and suddenly locked onto a pitch black, opening a few dozen meters away, the entrance to the abandoned old mine 3. No wind, no vibration. That pocket of darkness looked like a sanctuary of absolute silence. If he could just get inside and block out the noise, he could regroup and counterattack. That single thought anchored his last shred of sanity. He channeled every last ounce of his strength and gave a desperate, ragged wave of his hand. The 12 wounded soldiers scrambled to their feet, stumbling and leaning on each other as they rushed toward the opening. One by one, they plunged into the bottomless dark. The combat boot of the final Vanguard soldier had just vanished into the shadows of the mine entrance. The moment the last Vanguard soldier's boot disappeared into Old Mine 3, Old Boyd bit down on his chewing tobacco, his lips curling back to reveal a chipped front tooth. He flicked his cigarette stub, burned right down to the knuckle, into the churning mountain fog. Dressed in his oil and moonshine-stained overalls, he grabbed the tailgate of a pickup, hoisted up a tightly bound bundle of mining-grade black powder, and let out a gravelly roar that easily cut through the idling V8s. "Move your asses, boys. Seal up the other 3 backup exits. Don't let these hairless rats burrow their way out." The surrounding Appalachian mountain men erupted into a unified roar and sprang into action. One guy climbed into the cab of a tracked bulldozer, its diesel engine vibrating loose granite off the cliff face. The heavy blade pushed a massive slab of weathered rock, rumbling toward the other 3 hidden exits to block them off. Another man yanked out a length of fuse and started wrapping it around the dynamite bundles. The heavy earmuffs hung around their necks, and logging chainsaws were already revving up, spitting sparks ready to carve the rock and seal the tunnels. 2 boys in work jackets parked a reinforced armored truck right across the main entrance. The headlights cut diagonally into the dark mine, illuminating a sparkling cloud of floating coal dust. Old Boyd wiped the tobacco spit from his chin, sat down against a thick cast-iron ventilation pipe near the main entrance, and thumbed 2 fresh rock salt shells into his Remington. A crisp click-clack, and the breech snapped shut, hot and ready. He tore off a chunk of smoked beef jerky, shoved it in his mouth, and pressed his ear flush against the freezing iron pipe. Through the heavy cast iron and thick layers of rock, he could hear it clear as day. Deep inside the mine, the alien combat boots, slick with purple blood, were crunching over fine coal dust. Step by step, moving steadily toward the main shaft, 200 meters below ground. Zero's blood-stained boots crushed the fine coal dust. Every step produced a sharp grinding sound that bounced off the smooth, high-density coal seams. It hit the opposite wall and ricocheted back, stacking up into a chaotic cascade of echoes inside the narrow shaft. His brain was still misfiring from the sensory overload of the V8 engines. Every sonic vibration felt like a red-hot wire twisting into his exposed nerves. Purple blood ran down his cheeks, dripping onto the black dust and blooming into dark, bruised patches. He had retreated into this underground space, desperate to escape the surface noise, clinging to the hope that it would give his battered senses a moment to recover, to regroup and find an extraction route. He raised his wrist and activated his bio-sonar array, now operating at barely 50% capacity. The moment the screen lit up, it was instantly suffocated by an overwhelming flood of blood-red signals. His own heartbeat, the ragged breathing of his subordinates, the friction of their boots against the coal, even the hum of blood rushing through their veins. Everything was endlessly refracted and amplified by the enclosed rock walls. It mutated into thousands of aggressive, hostile target signatures. The signals stacked on top of each other until the display was nothing but a strobing, bloody mess. He was completely blind. The soldiers around him began shivering uncontrollably. One of them couldn't hold it in and let out a muffled groan. That tiny whimper exploded like a bomb in the confined tunnel, vibrating the walls and sending showers of loose coal raining down. The terrified soldiers instantly raised their weapons, knuckles stark white. Zero opened his mouth to order them to stay absolutely quiet, but a sudden, blinding spike of pain ripped through his skull. He grabbed the rock wall for support. At the exact same moment, a clear, sharp, metallic clang rang out from the ventilation pipe directly above them. 7 or 8 hulking shadows blocked the 3 ventilation pipes at the top of Old Mine 3. Their boots ground the dry coal dust to powder. That sharp clang was from Joey taking a solid alloy steel wrench and smashing it against the pipe, a precise, deafening wake-up call to the rats underground. Every mountain man had their heavy earmuffs clamped tight, with an extra double layer of wax stuffed in their ears. Nobody was worried about blowing their own eardrums out. They'd all grown up with the mountain-shattering roar of straight-piped V8s. One of them was holding bundles of heavy-duty firecrackers, completely wrapped in black powder. He trimmed the fuses down to nothing, struck a match on his jeans, and lit the whole cluster at once. Sputtering, sulfur-scented sparks rained into the steel pipe as the massive chain of explosives dropped straight into the bottomless dark. Several rednecks wielding heavy wrenches wound up and swung like hell, smashing the freezing steel pipe. Every hammer strike vibrated the metal so violently that flakes of rust and coal dust rained down on the aliens below. The rock beneath their feet immediately erupted into a dense, rapid tremor. The numbness shot straight up through the soles of their boots. Even the glass windows on the armored truck parked outside rattled violently. The enclosed coal mine acted like a massive acoustic resonator, amplifying every single firecracker explosion by a factor of 300. The shrieking shockwaves ricocheted off the rock walls, turning the pitch-black tunnel into a lethal, invisible hammer. Old Boyd leaned back against the truck bumper, took a bite of his half-eaten beef jerky sandwich, and rubbed the button on his CB radio with his thumb. He grinned and growled into the mic, "Taste some redneck fireworks, y'all." Through 100 meters of solid rock, you could faintly hear the delicate, fragile sound of breaking glass, the sound of 3 alien soldiers' skulls being literally crushed inward by the acoustic pressure wave. The overlapping explosions continued to ping-pong wildly down the mine shaft. The tidal wave of sound grew taller and deadlier, crashing directly into Zero, who was already huddled in the dark of the main tunnel, leaning against the wall and shaking violently. Thick purple foam surged from his ear canals. Zero could clearly feel his left auditory nerve being sawed back and forth by a white-hot rasp. Then came the crisp, sickening sensation of tearing. Boiling liquid coated half his face. He lost his hearing entirely. All that remained was a relentless, chaotic resonance bouncing around inside his skull, trying to vibrate his brain matter into liquid mush. The remaining 9 soldiers were crammed into the dark of the main shaft. All of them slid down the rock face into a pile of coal dust. Their resonance rifles hit the floor, and nobody bothered to pick them up. Purple blood misted from the seams of every single visor. Their bodies convulsed like they were plugged into a live electrical socket. Zero pushed off the freezing coal and forced himself up. His pristine, specialized armor was caked in grime and blood. His normally stoic compound eyes were a mess of ruptured red vessels. He had been the absolute apex predator of the Galactic Silence Vanguard since he was 25. He was used to harvesting prey in the absolute, pristine silence of the dark. He never imagined war could look like this. No elegant resonant sniping, no silent, invisible infiltration. Just an endless, brutal, barbaric barrage of physical noise, swinging like a madman's sledgehammer, trying to cave his skull in. In the dark, even the faint drip-drop of water deep in the mine made his eyeballs twitch wildly. Acting on pure instinct, he waved his hand frantically, issuing a blurred command to split the survivors into 2 groups. 5 men were ordered to crawl up the narrow, abandoned minecart tunnel on the left. Find an exit at any cost. The 5 alien soldiers staggered to their feet, gripped whatever resonance rifles they could still hold, and hunched their shoulders as they squeezed into the claustrophobic cart tunnel. The loose coal beneath their boots tumbled down the slope. Step by agonizing step, they crawled upward toward the exit. Old Boyd's boots stopped a cascade of fine coal dust rolling out of the tunnel. His calloused palm rubbed the edge of his heavy earmuffs. The half-chewed wad of tobacco in his mouth was turning black. He peered down into the steep, pitch-black minecart tunnel and spotted 5 faint, wobbling blue lights, the bioluminescent glow of the alien subsonic shielding suits. 5 bastards clutching their fancy rifles, shaking with every step they took toward the surface. He picked up a 1-gallon tin can sitting by his foot, the label long worn off. It was pure 90 proof, uncut moonshine. The second he twisted the metal cap off, the sharp, stinging smell of raw ethanol punched the air. With a flick of his wrist, Boyd dumped the entire gallon down the steep rock face. The liquid cascaded down the coal seams. The volatile fumes instantly flooded the narrow shaft. Even the tips of his beard smelled like booze. 2 young mountain men holding shotguns beside him quickly stepped back, taking cover behind a massive granite boulder. "Boyd, ain't that enough to blow half the damn mountain apart?" one of them yelled. Boyd spat a wad of tobacco juice and grinned, showing off a missing front tooth. "These glowing sumbitches like a nice quiet hunt. Let's give 'em a hot steam bath." He dug out a box of matches, pulled out a thick strike-anywhere match, and struck it hard against his brass belt buckle. A blue flame flared to life. The flame danced. Boyd let go. The match tumbled end over end, dropping straight down into the alcohol-soaked tunnel. A muffled boom shook the earth. A tidal wave of hellish orange fire tore violently down the narrow incline. Blistering heat blasted out of the exit, forcing Boyd to take a half-step back. The tips of his beard singed and curled. The smell of scorched meat mixed with the sweet scent of burning alcohol drifted up. The screams in the tunnel didn't even last a full second before they were completely snuffed out. 200 meters away, deep in the main shaft, Zero was slumped on the freezing coal, completely deaf. The severed nerves in his skull throbbed relentlessly. He had just raised a blood-soaked hand to signal his remaining 4 soldiers when the solid rock beneath his feet violently bucked. A wave of scorching heat, carrying the heavy scent of charred flesh, flooded through the cracks in the rock face. Zero was sitting half-submerged in his own purple blood. His left auditory nerve was totally fused. His entire skull felt like it was being hollowed out by a ceaseless steel drill. That heat wave carried the unmistakable stench of the 5 men he had just sent up the tunnel. He didn't even need to look to know they were ashes. The 4 surviving grunts were slumped against the opposite wall. Their subsonic shielding suits were torn wide open. A mist of purple blood continuously sprayed from their ear canals and eye sockets. They were twitching like electrocuted puppets. The moment that heat wave washed over their faces, their final thread of sanity snapped. All 4 simultaneously raised their violently shaking arms, aimed at the rock walls around them, and frantically pulled the triggers on their resonance rifles. Waves of pale blue resonance energy pounded into the brittle coal seams. The dozen or so previous explosions had already severely compromised the structural integrity of the ceiling. The relentless barrage of resonance energy was the final straw. Massive slabs of dark brown coal and jagged granite collapsed. A half-ton block of ceiling coal dropped straight down, instantly pancaking the lead soldier's shoulder and crushing his resonance rifle into a twisted lump of scrap iron. The remaining 3 pulled their triggers even faster. More chunks of coal rained down. Flying shrapnel snapped the stocks off their rifles and shattered their energy cores. Within 10 seconds, all 5 resonance rifles were rendered completely useless. Zero gripped his final tactical short blade at his waist. Bracing against the rock wall, he managed to pull himself halfway up. Suddenly, he felt a distinct, heavy, low-frequency vibration traveling through the freezing rock beneath his boots. It was coming from the main entrance, steadily advancing down the tunnel, step by step, straight toward him. Heavy-duty rubber earmuffs clamped down tight on Old Boyd's white-haired head. The 60-year-old had his Remington double barrel slung diagonally across his grease-stained overalls. His boots crunched over the shattered plastic components of the alien resonance rifles, smearing the purple alien blood all over the leather uppers. He led the way. Behind him, 4 redneck mountain men wearing the same earmuffs gritted their teeth, grunting as they pushed a heavy diesel generator and a massive, perfectly stacked wall of sound. 12 heavy-duty concert speakers stripped from an open-air festival. Every single cone was aimed straight down the dark tunnel, looking like a row of polished cannon barrels. Coal dust drifted down from the ceiling with every heavy footstep. In the confined space, the vibrations of their approach were magnified exponentially. A heavily bearded young mountain man stepped out from behind the speaker wall, patted the wiring harness, and gave Boyd a thumbs up. "We're all wired up, boss. Series and parallel look good. Max volume L push 150 decibels. Enough to give these bastards a hell of a hangover." Old Boyd sauntered over to the generator. He reached into his chest pocket, pulled out a beat-up, crinkled metal cassette tape, and snapped it into the old-school player mounted on the speaker rack. A solid click locked it in place. The harsh smell of diesel exhaust mixed with coal dust and the sweet metallic tang of alien blood filled his nose. His rough, heavily calloused hand grabbed the pull-start cord of the generator, his knuckles turning bone white from his grip. Zero lay paralyzed in the pile of bloody coal dust. His clouded optical nerves barely managed to piece together the silhouettes emerging from the dark. He couldn't hear a damn thing, but every shattered nerve ending in his body registered the heavy, rhythmic vibrations shaking the walls. Those Earth savages, wearing their thick acoustic earmuffs, were pushing a massive wall of black, iron-caged boxes straight into his tunnel. He lay half-submerged in his own leaked fluids. His left ear canal was a hollow, dead cavity. With every subtle vibration, it felt like someone was driving a glowing hot nail into his brain. His 4 surviving subordinates were pressed hard against the base of the rock wall, shuddering violently like broken bellows. The guy in the front, the one with the pancake shoulder, was using his last ounce of strength to try and burrow into a crack in the coal. Purple mist sprayed steadily from the seams of his visor. Zero's gaze was deadlocked on the wrinkled old earthling leading the pack. His bio-sonar array was utterly dead. His subsonic shielding suit was nothing but rags. The only thing he had left was the tactical blade hidden in his armor seams. He gripped the hilt so hard that purple blood dripped down the handle. He watched the old man's withered hand violently rip the cord. The diesel generator roared to life, shaking the earth. Black smoke billowed up toward the ventilation cracks. The entire 300-year-old, hollowed-out mine trembled. Pebbles of coal showered down like hail, bouncing off Zero's combat armor. Then, he watched the old man shove the dusty metal cassette into the square box, hook a thick thumb over the black volume knob, and ruthlessly crank it all the way to the maximum limit. The spindles engaged. The red indicator light flared blindingly bright. The air pressure inside the mine tightened to the point of rupture. The very next second, the distorted sonic wave dropped like an anvil. The 4 broken alien grunts, their nerves already pulverized by the subsonic assault, didn't even have the breath to scream. The soldier with the crushed shoulder went first. His bio-armor disintegrated at the point of impact. Under the sheer force of the acoustic resonance, the purple blood mist ruptured into a dense cloud. A split second later, his internal organs were liquefied into meat paste by the sound waves. He slid down the rock wall like a wet rag, melting into a puddle of purple sludge and coal dust. The second soldier rolled onto the ground, clutching his head, as his skeleton fractured inch by inch in perfect sync with the bass frequency. His dead shielding suit shattered like tissue paper. Within 3 seconds, he was dead. The remaining two couldn't even twitch, forced to watch as the resonant frequencies literally tore their bodies to shreds. The enclosed mine shaft was completely flooded with a thick fog of purple blood, violently blown back and forth against the rock walls by the sheer force of the sound. Zero tried to twitch his fingers to grab his blade, but the acoustic shockwave slammed into the surviving remnants of his auditory nerves, instantly fusing them. A boiling, apocalyptic pain detonated inside his brain. Purple blood gushed out of all his orifices at once. He lost all feeling in half of his body. He could do nothing but lie paralyzed in his own gore, gasping raggedly. Through his blurred vision, cutting through the bloody mist, he saw the shadows of those earmuff-wearing men step out from behind the wall of sound, walking slowly and deliberately right toward him. The heavy rubber earmuffs pinched the back of old Boyd's neck. He kicked aside a pile of pulverized purple meat blocking his path. The steel toes of his boots ground over the plastic remnants of alien rifles with a sharp, crunching squeal. The walls of the sealed mine were still vibrating from the residual acoustics. Fine coal dust rained down the back of his collar. The 3 redneck mountain men behind him had their rifles racked and ready. The beams from their flashlights danced wildly across the dust-filled tunnel. The beams finally locked onto Zero, sitting dead center in the tunnel. The elite commander of the Galactic Silence Vanguard was lying in a pool of his own dark purple blood. Half his body was completely dead. His intricate bio-sonar array was shattered glass. Purple blood steadily leaked from his face. Only one dull gray-blue eye remained open, staring blankly at the ceiling. Old Boyd walked right up to him. He reached over and violently twisted the audio player's switch off. The chest-rattling bass died instantly. The only sound left in the tunnel was the soft patter of falling coal dust. He pulled off one side of his earmuffs, wiped the sweat off his face, and raised the double-barreled Remington. He shoved the cold, blued steel of the barrel right into Zero's bleeding, exposed ear canal. Purple blood trickled down the barrel, staining Boyd's oil-slicked overalls. Zero's single-functioning pupil shrank to a pinprick. The military comms unit around his neck was still glowing with a faint blue light. The signal connection to the mothership in low orbit was still wide open. Old Boyd hooked his calloused thumb over the hammer. A crisp click echoed as a fresh rock salt shell was chambered and ready. His index finger rested perfectly on the trigger. In low Earth orbit, inside the command bridge of the Galactic Silence Vanguard flagship Shadow, a state of absolute dead silence had been maintained for 3 standard hours. All the senior staff officers held their breath. Even the flow of their bodily fluids was filtered through acoustic dampeners. They were waiting for Captain Zero to transmit the victory code from the primitive observation point. They had projected that exterminating these savages, who hadn't even mastered controlled nuclear fusion, would take 20 minutes, tops. Suddenly, an incoming signal from Captain Zero's active comms unit flooded the bridge's acoustic relay system. It started as faint static. A microsecond later, the overloaded, heavily distorted, screeching feedback of an electric guitar hit like a glowing red sledgehammer, slamming directly into the bio-sonar arrays of every alien on the bridge. The three junior officers in the front row dropped instantly, going completely rigid. Purple blood gushed frantically from their unprotected ear canals. The crystal observation monitors violently vibrated, spider webbing with massive cracks. The crystal-clear orbital feed of Earth instantly dissolved into a chaotic, blood-red blur. The High Commander clamped his hands over his violently throbbing temples. The microscopic fibers of his subsonic shielding suit had already torn under the pressure. Gritting his teeth against the skull-crushing agony, he stared dead at the signal source. For 20 straight seconds, no tactical updates. No pleas for backup. Just pure, unadulterated, barbaric acoustic violence, grinding every nerve ending into dust. The 20 seconds ended. A crisp, dry blast of a shotgun cut clean through the noise. Absolute silence returned to the bridge. The blue blip representing Zero's vital signs flickered once on the tactical display and then vanished completely. The High Commander's finger hovered right over the Initiate Orbital Bombardment button. Half an hour ago, he was mocking Zero for being paranoid and bringing 20 elite troops to a primitive dirt ball. Now, the aftershocks in his skull had completely drained his physical ability to even make a fist. The barrel of the Remington slid out of Zero's ruined ear canal. The rust on the muzzle was smeared with dark purple gore. Old Boyd planted his boot on the corpse's shoulder and gave a vicious kick. Zero's body tumbled down the vertical drop of the abandoned shaft. A heavy, muffled thud echoed back up from hundreds of meters in the dark. Boyd pulled the heavy earmuffs from around his neck, wiped his soot-covered face with his massive, calloused palm, and turned around to yell at the rednecks holding their rifles. "Get your asses back up there and check the fire. If that corn mash burns cause of you, I'm gonna be pissed." The tunnel erupted into a chorus of rough laughter. Guys hoisted up the speakers and dragged the generator, heading for the exit ladders. As he turned to leave, Old Boyd's boot kicked a hard, glowing object on the floor. It was Zero's military comms unit, still maintaining an open channel to the shadow in orbit. A faint, raspy, agonizing groan drifted out of the speaker. The severely traumatized High Commander, his finger still hovering uselessly over the orbital strike button. Old Boyd grinned widely, showing off his half-missing yellow tooth. He didn't smash the comms unit. Instead, he took a few steps back to the audio player, which still had the metal cassette jammed inside. He taped the alien comms unit dead center onto the membrane of the largest, heaviest speaker. He reached out, grabbed the volume knob, and with a loud click, cranked it all the way to the 140 decibel red line. The distorted, heavy metal riff detonated inside the sealed tunnel. Coal dust rained from the ceiling. The sheer vibration made the soles of their boots numb. Half an hour later, 7 or 8 straight piped V8 diesel pickups roared down the winding mountain road, blasting their throttles. Old Boyd sat in the bed of the lead truck, chewing on his half-eaten beef jerky sandwich from earlier that day, watching the thick fog roll back in and swallow Old Mine 3. The alien comms unit had long since melted into the speaker cone. The shadow in low orbit had gone dead silent. The command for orbital bombardment was never sent. Old Boyd took a massive swig of the 90-proof raw moonshine. It burned so good he coughed twice. He leaned back and roared into the howling mountain wind. "Fuck your Galactic Silence Vanguard. This mountain is mine." The roaring engines drowned out the rest of the world. The Appalachian mountains still belonged to the rednecks, their moonshine and their black powder.
Hello everyone, the author of this story. Finishing this piece felt exactly like throwing back a massive gulp of Old Boyd's 90-proof moonshine, harsh, head-spinning, but incredibly satisfying. When I first brainstormed this story, I spent a lot of time thinking about the true core of the HFY, humanity fuck yeah. Genre? We've all seen the tropes of humans piloting massive mechs or sleek starships to defeat alien armadas. But what I really wanted was a more primal clash, a collision defined by extreme contrast. That's how the juxtaposition of the Galactic Silence Vanguard and the Appalachian mountain men came to life. On one side, you have a highly advanced alien civilization that worships absolute silence, hyper-rationality, and arrogant precision. On the other, you have Earth's gritty, stubborn rednecks raised on the deafening roar of V8 engines and the smell of black powder. I deliberately stripped away all the sci-fi tropes from the human side. No energy shields, no laser blasters. Just moonshine, double-barreled shotguns, and ear-splitting heavy metal. The most exhilarating part of writing this was orchestrating that reverse asymmetrical warfare. The alien's arrogant, hypersensitive biosonar is completely dismantled by the most unrefined brute force physical noise imaginable. Old Boyd isn't some superhero trying to save the galaxy. He's just a stubborn old man protecting his moonshine stills. Yet, it's exactly this feral, chaotic vitality, this absolute refusal to play by the rules, that captures the pure, unyielding resilience of humanity. I hope you enjoyed this grease-stained, darkly comedic tale. And I hope that in this often absurd universe, we can all keep a bit of Old Boyd's spirit, the courage to roar right back at the dark.